Welcome back, fellow walkers of the Multiverse. So, you join me at a point in time where we're about to learn and witness the unquestionable annihilation of the Thran and the official and effective end of their era. I'm going to put a bit of a disclaimer right here at the beginning of this episode. It's a parental advisory, in a way. And that is because, as you may or may not have noticed, whether you're kind of familiar with the lore or not, Magic's lore, even during this abridgment, tends to not sand off the sharp edges of its depictions and descriptions and scenes and actions of violence and grotesqueries and, things of that manner. Anything that you would maybe consider kind of R-rated adult content. And this is a running thread that goes through all of kind of the technique of how Magic storytelling is told. And I personally think it's a huge asset to the storytelling, because at its core, Magic the Gathering is a kind of young adult to adult high fantasy series. At its core, a trading card game, of course. And there is no need to really sugarcoat these very important details and descriptions, which, despite them being very graphic and visceral, do lend a lot to the impact and the resonation of their story. So I did want to put this here as a slight warning that this episode in particular does have some scenes of quite graphic murder and violence and Yawgmoth surgeries, which is unfortunately to be expected. But yes, I wanted to put that there just in case. But otherwise, let us get on with it. So this is the final episode in the Thran era. It is a hefty one, so sit back and I hope you enjoy. Yawgmoth had deployed his mass eradication weapon from the control of the Null Sphere. The malignant cloud of pure mana had slain the opposing Thran army effortlessly. Now, the milky cloud of raw energy had to be contained lest it spread and consume more than Yawgmoth had intended. The Null Sphere, that horrifying pale moon, went to work absorbing the mana for an entire day. As the last wisps of sheer energy were drawn away, it revealed the cleansed battlefield underneath. None had survived, and any evidence of the participants in this battle was hard to find. No armour, no weaponry, no skeletons. Even the land itself had been consumed. Megheddon Defile had become a hollowed out crater. Beyond the unscathed shining capital of Halcyon, smears of dark blotted the clear sky to the west. Two more Thran fleets, accompanied with two mammoth armies, were heading their way. Yawgmoth returns to Halcyon and addresses the people in his most galvanizing speech. He calls to the citizens to let the yearning for war and valor blaze through their bodies and enter their hearts. This is their moment of true ascension, not only above the traitorous Thran alliance, but above the world, their bodies, and their souls. They are no longer among the damned and diseased. They have fought and suffered for this moment, and now is the time to seize it and ascend from their mortal coils into the embrace of immortality. He calls for all who are not actively engaged in defending the city to enter the righteous ranks of the Phyrexians and to claim Phyrexia as their home, with the promise of godhood therein. Rebec at this time is in the highest reach of her temple's parapet, slouching in the position the shockwave of the stone charger had pushed her into. She stares blankly in a state of sheer horror. She has become what she had just witnessed, an atrocity. The people in the streets of Halcyon below flooded to the caves of the damned, giving themselves to Phyrexia. They wished to join alongside her in the ranks of atrocity. Yawgmoth comes to her. He talks to her with a dying sun gleaming in his eyes. He attempts to persuade her from the truth she is only now beginning to realise. Rebec is steadfast in rebuffing him. Yawgmoth begins to laugh as Rebec confesses the guilt she harbours over helping Yawgmoth to ascend. "You think too much of yourself," he says, but who else could have been such a fervent envoy of his ideals, if not her? Yawgmoth had taken her belief in the betterment and ascension of her people and twisted it into an abomination on par with his Phyrexian creations. Her people have ascended out of fear, not hope. Yet, she had willingly cultivated it alongside Yawgmoth. The blinding force of her belief in ascension had sealed Halcyon's fate. Yawgmoth takes her in his arms, and she struggles to break free. After a few moments, though, the gravity of hopelessness stifles her movements, and she goes limp. Fighting against Yawgmoth now was pointless. The armies of the Thran Alliance clashed with Halcyon's main forces soon after. The metal sphere of the Null Moon surveys it all and turns artifact creations against their creators as the vengeful, vicious legions of Phyrexians do the rest. It is a quick and brutal battle. It trickles to a ranged skirmish. In the meantime, there was not much more Yawgmoth could do on Dominaria in Halcyon, so he focuses attention back on Phyrexia. He merges with the core of his plane again, once more becoming its dark heart. On the first sphere, Gix sees to the enlistment of the Halcyon citizens who wish to join the Phyrexian ranks. None would be spared for immortality. On the second sphere, the development of further Stone Charger mass weapons was underway by the scuttling artifact inhabitants of Phyrexia. Yawgmoth's concentration, however, was focused on the fourth sphere, where the now entitled Vat Priests set aside their work on Phyresis in order to study and weaponize other plagues. Yawgmoth desired a contagion that would indiscriminately infect untold thousands of millions in the surrounding areas around Halcyon, but which would never touch Halcyon itself. The ambassadors from the allied nations were the ideal subjects to experiment on with weaponized strains of plague. Then, a presence joins him in the inner sanctum of his world, Dyfed the Planeswalker. Then, a presence joins him in the inner sanctum of his world, Dyfed the Planeswalker. She tells Yawgmoth to surrender his godhood, for after all she is a Planeswalker, and if he does not relinquish his control quietly, then she simply has to force him to. She sees she has made a critical error in her judgment of Yawgmoth all this time, and that needed to be rectified now. She mentions that there is another Planeswalker amongst them, a latent spark which will ignite and will rise to save the people Yawgmoth had so wronged. He says she can do whatever she likes, but if his link to Phyrexia is severed, the ambassadors that are kept alive by his mind on the fourth sphere will perish in agony. Dyfed shakes her head, for they will not do so under the healing of her magic. She grasps his hand and takes them both to the fourth sphere. The ambassadors are contained in vats overseen by the red-robed, uncannily lean and slender forms of the Vat Priests. Dyfed spots the ambassadors once she is able to pull her gaze away from the horrific layout and existence housed within this sphere. Unlike the calculated gradual metamorphosis of other Phyrexian designs, the ambassadors have been sliced up and sewn back together haphazardly, transforming them into grotesque shadows of their former selves. While Dyfed is entranced by the horror before her, Yawgmoth plunges a dagger deep into her forehead. He grabs her hair with his free hand while he drives it deeper into her skull, into her brains, wiggling the blade, churning and scrambling inside her skull. He speaks to her during this disgusting act, saying that he will find the internal organ that grants the gift of planeswalking, and will cut it from her and graft it to himself to complete his own personal ascension. Yawgmoth returns to Halcyon and mounts a sky assault at and above the allied Thran armada that Halcyon's ray cannons had thus far kept at bay. Meanwhile, Rebec makes her move. She and a collection of goblins scour the grounds of her husband's decrepit mana rig chamber to find a control stone that she can augment into her temple to allow it to fly as the Null Moon does. She planned to captain the Soaring Temple and save as many of the Halcyon citizens as she possibly could. All this disease, all this destruction, and the ambition that had been cultivated had been granted by this Chamber of Power Stones, and now it was going to grant the freedom to end it. Yawgmoth's war caravel is slain in the skies, and it tumbles him overboard to the battlegrounds below. His Power Stone armour negates any potential serious injury, and using his cunning, he makes it through the combat planes to meet a troop of Steeplejack Phyrexians. The leader of this particular sect of Phyrexians is Zod, the very man who had edged Yawgmoth to the epiphany of metal in the use of dealing with Thoresis, and of course, as the primary component of Phyrexian ascension. Zod himself is now a prime example of Phyrexian ingenuity, and with Yawgmoth, they return to Halcyon. Gix had proven himself a more than competent commander in Yawgmoth's absence in Halcyon. He had quelled a brewing rebellion within Yawgmoth's own ranks when their leader was presumed dead. Gix had flooded the city with the new Phyrexian creations, the former citizens of Halcyon, as a show of force and to display the glory of Phyrexian might. The city is now near siege by the allied Thran alliance, and Yawgmoth is more than happy upon his return to leave further enlistment of citizens and the retaliation preparations to Gix. Rebec goes to her husband's side to tell him of the plan to save them from Yawgmoth's twisted ascension. When she arrives, she finds Glacian has slipped into a coma and has subsequently died. Wrought with grief, she doesn't notice Yawgmoth's presence. He does nothing but offer her comfort, and promises her that both her and her husband can be healed. He takes the genius of Halcyon and his wife, the Thran Angel of Architecture, to Phyrexia. She is too distraught to resist, and the weight of desolation presses down upon her. Yawgmoth has truly won. On Phyrexia, Yawgmoth unveils his intentions to Rebec with horrific candour. He has given the rebelling city-states of the Thran an ultimatum: surrender or be purged by his mana-gorging weapons of mass destruction. Not just their forces and military, no, their cities and their innocents. Then, after that matter is settled, he plans to bring the glory of the Phyrexian Thran to the Multiverse. Dyfed's body had been sliced and diced like a cadaver. The priests documented every facet of her being, and he was sure they would find what gave the capability to planeswalk, and this is how they will conquer. Yawgmoth is called back to Halcyon as a response to his ultimatum has been reached. He binds Rebec in the heart of Phyrexia and leaves her there. The allied Thran states refuse Yawgmoth's ultimatum by further show of force and bolstering military numbers, marching on the city proper. Now, the Thran were to taste his anger and wrath. Encircling the city from all sides, the rebellion flooded inward. Yawgmoth and his small concentrated fleet drop a pair of stone chargers in the midst of the bulk of the Thran alliance troops. The milky cloud of mana-greed incarnate claims untold numbers, as it had before in Megheddon Defile. The Null Moon also does as it did then, mitigating the cloud from reaching the city by absorbing it. Yawgmoth sits at the helm of his new war caravel and sips wine with a victorious smile. That is, until the artificers within the Null Moon sabotage it with their suicide, sacrificing themselves to prevent the neutralization of the ever-swelling death cloud. Yawgmoth realizes this too late as the scouring cloud drifts towards the capital of Halcyon. Rebec breaks free of Phyrexia by invoking the echo of her past feelings of adoration towards Yawgmoth and communicating them towards the sentient plane. Her admiration had been true once, and for this one last time, she meets with it again to escape with the medical capsule encasing her husband, before she exercises any positive association with Yawgmoth from her mind for good. She heads for her Temple of Ascension. Meanwhile, the remaining untarnished citizens of Halcyon panic as they see the annihilating cloud close in on their city. They flee to the temple. They also hope that Rebec arrives before any other to fly them to safety. Gix arrives first, and he and his force begin slaughtering the fleeing citizens. He experiences a revelry that may perhaps outrank Yawgmoth's own. Blood splatters the shimmering architecture and screams reverberate throughout its lofty halls. The citizens are able to abate Gix and his unit and manage to engage the Flight Power Stone. The temple begins to soar upward as if cut of an invisible anchor. Then, the eradicating cloud billows over the walls of Halcyon. Rebec watches her temple ascend. Some of the people had been saved, but she has no time to savour the moment as she becomes aware of the cloud enveloping the city. Ironically, the only chance of her survival is to descend into the caves of the damned, so she and her comatose husband inside the capsule do just that. Yawgmoth had gone into immediate action to round up the remaining stragglers in the city, and then he led a charge of his Phyrexian unit to guide any living being down into the caves of the damned, and then through the portal to Phyrexia. All the while he shouts to all that will hear how though their city and the Thran are lost, they are destined to become so much more and achieve so much more. He tells them of his paradise, of their grand multiverse conquering to come, and they all file through the portal to Phyrexia. Rebec hears the thunderous clamour of fleeing citizens and ducks into a side passage with Glacian. She removes the cover of the medical capsule and gazes upon his face, taking her last moments to be with him and promise that the cloud will dissolve them so that they can be together in death. As she gives him a final caress, her breath catches in her throat. There is an unusual feverish warmth in his side, underneath the bandaging of his surgery wound Yawgmoth had given him. She tears the cloth off and discovers behind the savage crisscrossing of stitching, a charged stone throbs. Yawgmoth had opened her husband and had hidden the two halves of the portal's heart within his body. She finds a scalpel and cuts them out of Glacian's body. Her hands drenched in her husband's blood, Rebec forces the two halves of the Power Stone together. A blinding, intense heat bursts forth, rendering her to her knees, yet she does not let the stone go. Then, a voice comes into her mind. Her husband, the latent planeswalker, Glacian, speaks to her. He explains the stone has become one with him, taking on the properties of his vast, untapped potential. As he had the unrealized energies as a planeswalker, the stone had been infused with considerable arcane strength. And now, together, they must descend to the portal of Phyrexia and seal it with Yawgmoth on the other side, where he can never return to assert his grand scheme to conquer the multiverse. Rebec staggers towards the portal and the mirror podium which keeps the link between the planes alive. The essence of her husband is warm within the stone, and warm against her heart as she cradles it to her chest. Yawgmoth calls to her through the mouth of the portal, on the side of his Phyrexian plane, and attempts to draw Rebec into him one last time. She stays steadfast, and whispering goodbye to her husband and Yawgmoth both, places the stone atop the pedestal. Yawgmoth howls. It erupts with a brilliant, deafening light, and soon after, the portal dies. Rebec turns and walks from the darkness of the caves. Once outside, light shimmers down on her through the rolling, scouring cloud that has claimed Halcyon. Then, she too is engulfed by the whiteness along with the rest of Halcyon. She finally achieves her ascension. And that, my fellow walkers and Vorthos mages, is a conclusion to the Thran era. The mana-consuming clouds released by Yawgmoth's weapons were said to have eventually dissipated after getting their fill on the lands that the Thran once lived on. Though, as we will discover further on, some relics of the Thran persevered through this annihilation and became the basis for many events to come. Now, we are going to go on to the time of the brothers in upcoming episodes. This is the very beginning of a huge chain of events and arc hinging on two very important characters in the MTG lore, Urza and Mishra. At unspecified points between the Thran era and the upcoming brothers, important events do occur but on other planes, and these will be presented in episodes peppered in between the main episodes relating to the brothers. This sounds confusing, but the best way to think of it is the brothers episodes are following a single straight timeline forward, which is officially known and agreed upon by a lot of Vorthos fans as Year Zero onward in contemporary lore. And the other events on other planes are important to cover due to their impact later, or just because they're awesome as well, are either backwards offshoots from the Year Zero or offshoots from the main brothers timeline, so from the Year Zero onwards, but branching off onto different planes, but can be in tandem or can be slightly mistimed. It's a bit all over the place, but there is much to cover. The difference between the episodes will be clearly titled to hopefully mitigate any confusion in the already confusing timeline. So, in the next episode, that is where we will begin, with the brothers. I hope you enjoyed, and until then, continue to release your untapped potential.